have to get rid of ISIS. We're going to get rid of ISIS. It will happen. It's happening right now.
We will hunt down and destroy ISIS.
America's strategy to defeat Daesh or ISIS is becoming clearer.
Mosul will happen. That's where a weight of effort is right now. Then Raqqa or the rest of Syria, ISIS's base in Syria will follow that.
A coalition of more than 60 countries are meeting in Washington this week to hammer out the plan ahead.
ISIS presents an ongoing challenge to our collective security. But as we have seen, it is not more powerful than we are when we stand together.
And they're in it for the long haul.
It's not a threat that's going to go away overnight, so it's going to, we all recognize this is going to be a long-fought battle.
But can the U.S. and its partners escalate their military offensive without repeating mistakes of the past? The U.S. has steadily moved away from mass ground wars that framed America as an invading power in Iraq and Afghanistan. Under former President Barack Obama, the controversial use of drones, special operation forces, and training programs for local militia reduced America's military footprint overseas. It's the U.S.'s policy of using surrogate armies known as by, with, and through. So far, the Trump administration has carried on that policy as the region prepares its latest push against Daesh. In Iraq, U.S. Special Operation Forces have embedded with the Iraqi army to retake the city of Mosul.
We have shared interest. Your soldiers are with ours in Iraq.
The U.S. has also stepped up its air campaign, launching more than 7,000 strikes in the last 2 months. In Syria, the U.S. is backing the Syrian Democratic Forces, mainly made up of the Syrian wing of the PKK terror group. On Wednesday, the U.S.-led coalition airdropped allied Syrian forces near Daesh's base in Raqqa. President Trump has signaled that pulling out of Iraq was a mistake.
We should never, ever have left.
But can his administration dive into a protracted war against Daesh while sticking to the president's new national focus?
America first.
Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Okay, to discuss this, I'm joined by Andreas Krieg. He's an assistant professor in defense studies at King's College London and works at the UK Defence Academy, specializing in military and security affairs in the Middle East. And with me here in the studio in Istanbul is Richard Atwood. He's the director of the International Crisis Group's New York office and represents the ICG at the United Nations. He leads the group's research into Daesh and other terror threats. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Richard, as we speak, everybody's scrambling to try to verify this information about civilians being killed in a U.S. airstrike, in a dire stronghold. So many dozens of civilians possibly killed, which I guess highlights the fact that this war comes at a terrible cost. You co-authored the ICG report, Counterterrorism Pitfalls: What the U.S. Fight Against ISIS and Al-Qaeda Should Avoid. So what should they avoid in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, that's certainly one of them, I think. As you say, we published the report today, Counterterrorism Pitfalls: What the U.S. Fight Against ISIS and Al-Qaeda Should Avoid. It looks at some of the dilemmas that the new administration faces in trying to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda across the Middle East. Obviously, a lot of Trump's national security and foreign policy remains uncertain, but I think an escalation in attacks against ISIS and Al-Qaeda across the Middle East, across South Asia, looks likely. Now, of course, it's understandable that any U.S. leader wants to protect U.S. citizens from groups that want to kill them. On the other hand, I think there are some dangers in the way that there are some potential pitfalls in the way that operations are conducted and in their potential impact. I think the first of those, which you alluded to, is simply killing civilians. There's some talk now in the US that US rules on the use of force will be relaxed. We think this would be a mistake. I think the key to defeating...
Setting a higher ceiling to the civilian casualties.
Well, I think if you... Right, yeah, exactly. If you loosen the rules of procedure, inevitably, I think there's a greater risk of civilian casualties. Now, the key to defeating both ISIS and Al-Qaeda is winning over the communities in which they're operating. And obviously, killing civilians doesn't do that. I think it tends to play into the hands of more radical groups, groups whose agendas are more explicitly anti-American. I think the risk of additional civilian casualties is a real one. I think the second risk, which is worth highlighting already, is that the more aggressive counterterrorism operations across the Middle East play into other rivalries. I think if you look at the armed groups across the Middle East, both state and non-state, for few of them is fighting ISIS or Al-Qaeda the main priority. Most of them have other priorities. I think the fight around Raqqa is a very good example of this. It looks as though the US will support the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is essentially the YPG, or at least its fighting core is the YPG, which of course has links to the Turkish PKK. It looks as though the US, with additional special forces, additional US troops will back the YPG to take back Raqqa. Now, I think although President Erdogan has supported aspects of the plan in the past, I think there are clearly Turkish concerns that increasing arms to the YPG or the leverage, the political capital it may gain from taking back Raqqa could be used to pursue other ends.
So let's grab that and expand on it. Andreas, is that short-sighted? Enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, we've seen it historically, whether it's in Afghanistan and the Mujahideen to now. So, for example, the US supporting the YPG. The YPG fights ISIS, sure, it fights Daesh, but it's also involved in blowing up civilians in a place like Turkey, or maybe the Shia militias in places like Iraq. Do what you want to, you're fighting ISIS, it's cool, as long as you do it for now. Is this policy short-sighted, Andreas?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is the wider US policy at the moment. That is somewhat the legacy of the Obama administration, that we're trying to do as much as we possibly can with as little boots on the ground as we possibly can. Special forces here obviously are not counted as regular boots on the ground. So the Americans are trying to fight a war with a small footprint, with as little attention in terms of global public attention, but most importantly, as little public attention in America, in order not to avoid and try in an attempt to avoid a public outcry in the media towards a re-engagement in the Middle East. After the Bush years, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, the Americans don't want to be seen to be drawn back into a quagmire in the Middle East. So they're relying on air power, they're relying on surrogates on the ground, on different tribal factions all over the Middle East. And as you rightly point out, this is a short-sighted it's a very short-sighted approach, because what happens is you do get drawn into the war at times, and you're losing control over what's actually happening on the ground. So it's very difficult to actually maintain a leverage over your surrogates, whether it's the YPG or Shia militias, who have their own agenda, and they will continue fighting for their own agenda. And how do you maintain that kind of leverage? It's almost impossible. But for the Americans, this is the future of warfare. We see that in Somalia, we see that in Northern Africa as well. This over-reliance on special forces, local partners and surrogates, and air power. It's a very light footprint. It comes with a little economic cost, and most importantly with very little political cost. But does it actually solve the problem? Does it actually achieve the objectives? That's the big question. And over long term, I think the Americans are looking at this anti-ISIS war as not a short-term victory, or not a victory that will come in the short term, but a long-term engagement, where it's kind of a simmering war, where over many, many years, maybe a decade or longer, there will be some sort of indirect engagement via special forces and surrogates in the Middle East.
Richard, I mean, I guess it's a curious accident of history or twist of fate that it was former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Trump's opponent in the election, who said regarding Libya, what was it? We came, we saw, he died, with regards Gaddafi, right? And I guess that in many ways, for many people, that exemplifies the sort of policy, like, we don't really get involved. We get involved, but we don't get involved. But with the fight against Daesh, when we read in the news that the US is sending 400 more troops, and they're called advisors, to fight Daesh, at what point do those advisors become actual troops as the numbers get beefed up and the US gets more and more involved in, for example, trying to retake Raqqa?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say. I think there's a few points. I think, first of all, I agree completely with Andreas that the US is reluctant, I think, for domestic political reasons, for many other reasons, the legacies of Iraq and Afghanistan, to commit more US forces. That said, I'm not sure that more US forces are really going to do the job either. The US has deployed enormous numbers of forces in Iraq and Afghanistan In neither case have they managed to bring long-term stability to either country. If anything, they've often made things worse. So of course, the US now is working through proxies, and of course there's dangers in working through surrogates. Of course there are. Those surrogates will pursue other interests. They will look to leverage the counterterrorism operations, US counterterrorism support for other interests. I think that's inherent to the way the operations are being conducted. That said, I don't think committing more US troops is the answer either. I think if you look back over the last 5 years with the rise of ISIS and the dramatic expansion of al-Qaeda, particularly in Syria and Yemen, the growth of ISIS in Libya, although it has been...
You say, sorry to interrupt you, you say dramatic expansion of al-Qaeda. For many people, they think al-Qaeda's done, it's dead, and only ISIS has sort of replaced them in terms of the threat.
Well, I think
Tell me why they're not.
I think, interestingly, ISIS, there's still a long way to go before the movement is defeated. For sure, it will adapt and evolve, both in its heartlands in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, but it is on the back foot. I think al-Qaeda, on the other hand, is expanding. Its large affiliates in Yemen, in Syria, in Somalia to some degree, in the Maghreb, have, if anything, grown more powerful over the last few years. And they've done this with a strategy which is a little bit different from the Islamic State's. The Islamic State strategy is rooted in the particular history of Iraq, the recent history of Iraq. The Islamic State picked a fight with everyone, and it subordinated all other forms of Sunni resistance to its domination. Al-Qaeda hasn't. It's played a longer game. It's embedded itself in local uprisings. It's allied itself to other armed groups, as you can see in around Idlib in Syria or in the south of Yemen. And it may be that which is much more of a sort of classic insurgency strategy, it may be that strategy of Al-Qaeda pays more dividends over time. But what I wanted to say is that both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have exploited new wars and new state collapses in the Arab world in particular. They've grown as things fell apart. They exploit disorder. And I think it's important, even if the US is using proxies, which I think is inevitable, but it's important while the US uses proxies that it doesn't actually aggravate other conflicts, worsen the disorder, and play into the hands of the very groups that it's trying to defeat.
And there's no way anybody can ever guarantee that, right?
You can't guarantee it, but I think there are ways to conduct the war which would help mitigate against those things.
Andreas, at the moment, particularly when you look at a place like Syria, it seems as if all the players, all the belligerents are in agreement that Daesh is bad and Al-Qaeda is bad, or Nusra, or Jabhat Fatah Sham, whatever you want to call it. But on everything else, they disagree. From Assad to Russia to Iran, you name it. Is that sustainable? Is it a sustainable policy to have everybody on the same page, actively agreeing that they need to fight these terror groups, but disagreeing on everything else?
It relates back to the fact that ISIS will not be easily defeated. Even if we declare victory, ISIS will not be defeated because it's an idea. You cannot militarily defeat an idea as long as the grievances still are on the ground. And I think the key problem here in Syria is that the root cause of that conflict is still there, whether it's Assad or the regime or Iranian and Russian engagement. So the key problem here is we really need to look at the root cause. What we're doing at the moment is we're looking at short-term solutions. Short-term, from a Western point of view, is getting rid of Al-Qaeda, the jihadist, ISIS, and everybody who is on that jihadist front. But we're not really looking at what is the root cause and how do we tackle it, because it's impossible to come to a consensus together with Iran and Russia and also Turkey, who are the different players and patrons behind the various groups on the ground. And then obviously we have the GCC countries who also disagree on what is and what is not a moderate group to support. And that continues to this day. Is Ahrar al-Sham a moderate group, or are they too much of a jihadist leaning? These kind of disagreements persist, obviously. And now when we return to finding political solutions, what we see is in Geneva is that for the most part, these patrons who have all their little surrogates on the ground playing for them are meeting without actually the surrogates being involved. And that obviously it doesn't work either, because there needs to be, in the end of the day, this is a Syrian war that has to be decided by Syrians for Syrians, and there should be Syrian groups who will decide what will happen on the ground, not foreign patrons. Unfortunately, this kind of surrogate war has brought us to a situation where neither the surrogates on their own nor the patrons on their their own can make this decision. This kind of quagmire is, at the moment, I cannot see how this can be resolved very easily. So what we do is, let's try to fight ISIS, let's try to fight Al-Qaeda, but the root cause persists, which means, in the end of the day, this kind of war will go on and on and on until we actually tackle that root cause.
Okay, gentlemen, what you guys have said, I guess, is compulsory viewing for policymakers, and I hope they read the International Crisis Group report
on
as
the
well,
website.
Richard. Yeah, I mean, good advice. It's a big mess. Hopefully next year, this time, we won't be having the same conversation. Andreas Krieg and Richard Atwood, thank you very much for joining us.